Okay, all good now? Okay, so just for the people online, we're looking forward to hearing from you too. So please feed your questions through the app and we will interleave those with questions from the room. Right, without more ado, I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Onno van Kessel, who's the General Manager for CCS Development and Subsurface in Shell. And so he has the very responsible task of global technical delivery and competitiveness for Shell's pre-FEED CCS project portfolio. And so I can see you're an applied physicist by training, way back in the dim and not so distant past. But you've been with Shell since 1991 and you've traveled extensively as part of that role in Shell.
Indeed.
So I look forward to hearing your presentation. Over to you, Onno.
Thank you. Thanks. Just testing the sound. All good? Yeah, at the back. All right. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the International Society for Porous Media for having me here and giving me the opportunity. They did give me a difficult task, though, talking about energy transition and porous media. It's rather a big topic, so I'll do my best. Obviously, I can't go into a lot of detail, but I have my able panelists who will join me on stage later to take the questions and also elaborate in a couple of the areas of expertise that I don't have myself. So my role in Shell is, essentially to work up to the point of investment decision from a technical perspective, the entire carbon capture and storage funnel that Shell has. And that's rather a large funnel these days. So overall, we have a couple of hundred technical people actually working this funnel across the company, ranging from capture to transport, shipping, and then of course the subsurface. So overall, it's I would say, and I will be talking about it later, carbon capture and storage is scaling up quite rapidly. And I'll be examining together with the panel some of the factors of why that is and what we can learn from that. Right, so let me get on. And first, let me make sure it was working just now. Oh yeah, there we go. Right, we can skip that because Shell is a listed company. I need to show you this. I'll spare you the details, otherwise my 45 minutes would be up. So let's not go there. What will I be talking about today? A brief perspective on energy transition. So, what really are we talking about in terms of quantities of energy, quantities of storage, primary energy, energy use? Again, I can only kind of skim the surface in the time available. I will be using the recently published energy security scenarios that Shell does. Shell has been publishing global energy scenarios for decades, and this is the latest vintage. I would certainly encourage you to go online to the shell.com website where you can download these scenarios and a lot of the material and the data underpinning them, and you can build your own charts and everything. So there's a lot more to it. But I'll be using that and then, going into so what does that mean for the role of porous media technology in the energy transition, particularly in the area of storage? And again, my fellow panelists will be able to add a lot to that. Then focus a bit more on carbon capture and storage, because what I really want to talk about, and that's also the last point here, is what does it really take to upscale? You'll see from all the scenario work that there's a huge upscaling challenge ahead of us. We don't have a lot of time. So going into large-scale industrial size applications is really essential. And what can we learn from that? And that's also my job, in Shell when it comes to decision making on which projects are we or are we not going to do. And are we going to invest lots of money in? Then, of course, the technical perspective of what technology does it use? Does it work? What are the risks? That's all the questions I then get. So I hope I can add that experience into this discussion today. Right, then moving on to the scenario work. So really, as you know, many of you are modelers, I know, and I used to be a reservoir modeler myself. After studying physics, I did a lot of reservoir engineering for Shell. Of course, you start with inputs, and then you have sort of features that define your scenarios. What are the key parameters you want to look at? And then what are the outputs you are getting? And in a way, Shell scenarios underpinned by a world energy model are not that different. They are scenarios, I have to stress, so they're not predictions of any kind or, a judgment on anything. They're really there to help us explore how the world energy system could evolve under different sets of assumptions, using, of course, experience and realism, but more as an aid to decision making and good discussion rather than anything else. Two key inputs that are really essential are, of course, the amount of energy consumption in the world, and of course, the climate and the diminishing carbon budget to stay within the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in terms of the energy use, really the scenarios use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as one of the key inputs, which say that the part of the population that today doesn't have access to affordable, clean and secure, reliable energy will be we will all want and expect that to change over time. It is changing, and hopefully it will continue to change. But it does mean, combined with population growth, that overall energy consumption is continuing to grow. Even though in many countries it is not growing. And then, of course, the climate. So another important boundary condition to the energy system modeling is getting to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we'll see that there's some variation on the time frame, but ultimately over this century, all scenarios do end up meeting those goals. Then that in terms of key inputs, then if we move to kind of some of the features that distinguish the scenarios, and again there's a lot of storyline behind this that I can't go into now, but obviously shaping the energy system, there's numerous drivers that play out at a regional, at a national level, and that can all go in different directions depending, for example, on how much own energy resource a country has. So how import dependent is it? How worried is it about energy security? How low carbon or high carbon are those sources? How concerned and how material are the emissions in countries? So there's a lot of dynamics. Price sensitivity, some countries are very price sensitive, other countries much less so, depending on wealth. And then, of course, there's the outlook of access to energy and how many people live in energy poverty that needs to be addressed, etc. So a lot of sort of ingredients that shape energy policy and also the market dynamics. And this is kind of worked out in two contrasting scenarios. That's one is called Sky 2050. Where there is, let's say, a more collaborative, coordinated global acceleration towards net zero, and a more fragmented, more competitive, and more sort of dispersed way of moving in the same direction, but at a different pace and with different priorities along the way. So these drivers of societal pressures, the energy at hand and the affordability, plus of course the climate concerns can play out in these different directions. And that then has consequences, of course. So it has consequences for the primary energy mix. Where does the primary energy come from, and also how is the energy consumed? And I'll be showing some of these outputs in a minute. And of course, it has consequences for the rate of CO2 abatement and getting towards net zero. Overall, these scenarios show that really, if you then look at the changes, it's something like 60% of the world population that will really experience an energy transition. So significant change in either primary or secondary energy and in consumption. So yeah, I don't think I need to convince anyone here today. It is a global scale problem that really needs a global large scale action and will affect the majority of the population. Then, yeah, let's start looking at some of the outputs before then moving a bit closer to porous media. So there's a couple of takeaways from this scenario work that I think are important to emphasize here. Yeah, clearly what it says in red here, achieving a global temperature rise of less than 1.5 degrees requires extensive use of carbon sinks. How extensive? You can see here, maybe the numbers are a bit small, but it really moves towards gigaton per year scale. And whether it's then sort of 0.5 gigaton in the archipelago scenario or a couple of gigaton in the sky 2050, that's of course an open question. But compared to the 40 million tons a year or so of CO2 storage that we have today, this is a huge scale up. And the need for these carbon sinks is really driven by two things. First of all, of course, it's the limited carbon budget and the threatening overshoot. But it's also the continued need for chemical energy carriers. So electrification, I think that's the other big message out of this, and we'll go into it on the next slide as well. Electricity is also a big winner, clearly, out of the energy transition. There is no doubt that solar and wind in particular will be built out, and again see massive upscaling even from compared to the upscaling we have already seen to date. And that electricity as a final energy use vector will also see massive growth. It will be the dominant, electricity will be the dominant energy form in decades to come. And in electricity generation, solar and wind will be the dominant force. But having said all that, there are still many hard to abate sectors that rely on molecules, on chemical carriers that cannot electrify, either because of the process, where hydrocarbons are needed in some form, or because of the distance they face to competitive sources of electricity, for example, or the availability of low cost wind and solar in particular regions. So continued need for chemical energy carriers, which will then need to be supplied in a net zero way, and that comes in some, but not all cases, with the need for carbon capture and storage, and the overshoot that is threatening on emissions that can be offset. Let me not go further into this. Again, a lot of material is there for further reading if you want. Let's quickly look at the next set of outputs related to generation, and again stressing the message here of upscaling, which also for wind and solar, just as it is for carbon capture and storage, is not a straightforward process. It is particularly wind and solar are relatively space intensive. The energy density per area is not that high, and they require a lot of materials. They also require a lot of infrastructure upgrade because they are quite distributed and they are intermittent. And to cope with that, and yeah, we are seeing it, I guess, here in the UK, certainly in the Netherlands, where I live, investments in grid upgrades, in infrastructure are really needed. And again, these are all mega projects in their own right, often hundreds of millions worth of investment, all with their lead times, their permits, their need to buy materials. So you start running into different sets of constraints just than the technology alone. I think, yeah, let's then move on, and maybe the only other thing to say, maybe to preempt that question as well, where's hydrogen in all of this? And for sure, in this scenario work, again, you will see that there is an increasing role for hydrogen as part of that provision of chemical energy, if you like, molecular energy, but also as a source, of course, to upgrade hydrocarbons into synthetic plastics, for example, in the future. But the expectation is that hydrogen will certainly not be a dominant energy source or vector in the time frame of these scenarios. It ranges somewhere between 4 and 12%. So certainly important on a global scale, and again a massive upscale from where it is today, but not nearly as dominant as electricity. Then, yeah, let's get a bit more specific. I'm also doing a quick time check. Okay, thank you. Yeah, then I think I'm okay. So talking about advanced energy storage more as an example of the sort of things that yeah, start to become important when considering this upscaling within a relatively short time frame that is needed. Of course, to develop things like electricity storage or heat storage or underground hydrogen storage or new kind of unproven forms of CO2 storage. The fundamental phenomena are really important, and I know that that's what a lot of this conference is about, and they certainly need to be there and really well understood. It is not enough, however, and you know, technical superiority in its own right, something being technically better, more efficient, for example, or you know, having a different way of doing something requiring less energy. Those are all good things, don't get me wrong, but it can't be enough. And often I see in my job that things that are technically better don't necessarily make it into the final project decisions and the final project designs, because there's so many other things to consider. How for example, will customers look at it? Does it build a product that customers want to buy at the end of the day is really important. And whether that is a form of energy storage or a product that can be used to trade energy better, or in the case of CO2 storage, is it a lower carbon product or a net zero product that customers actually want to buy and maybe want to pay a bit of a premium for compared to the higher carbon alternative? That is something that really needs to be factored in early. And also, how can it be built? Is it scalable, and what sort of constraints do you start running in when it gets really big? You know, I grew up in near Eindhoven in the Netherlands, very, very close to the Philips laboratory at the time that was famous for inventions like the compact disc. But at some point, it also became famous for inventing things that were not really that popular in the market, even though they were considered technically really, really good. Yeah, if you aim something to be marketed, you know, on a truly global scale, then a lot of other things come into play. With that, let's yeah, look at how that then works for CCS as an example that, of course, is close to my heart and my daily job. So for CCS, the good thing is today we can already rely on a number of proven components throughout the entire value chain that I believe give us a really strong starting point, and that's also why companies like Shell are throwing so many resources at it today, and we are certainly not alone, fortunately, in that area. So, you know, starting from capture, then particularly pre-combustion processes for capturing CO2 have been operating for decades in many industries, and there's plenty of relatively low-cost CO2 sources available. Again, typically those decisions are not made without looking at the full hierarchy, if you like, of CO2 abatement. It's not like, oh, well, we have CO2 here, let's capture it. First question is always, can we avoid emitting it in the first place, either by not using the energy or by electrifying the process, if that is appropriate. But there are many sources for which capture technology is suitable and proven. Transport of CO2, again, is something that has been happening for a long time. CO2 pipelines, shipping, albeit at a bit smaller scale, but also for food and agro industries, for example. And then storage, of course, for EOR. I know there's a lot of expertise on storage in the room here today. Yeah, both for depleted fields from an EOR perspective and for saline aquifers. It's something that has been proven. That's not to say there's nothing to innovate there. There is a lot of innovation that can be done, and that is still necessary to enlarge the potential storage space, to find new ways of storing, for example, through mineralization, to store more efficiently, lower cost, to do cheaper monitoring, to better understand storage phenomena, cap rocks, etc., and to help us manage risks. Because again, that is something that in a project development perspective, the questions that most often I get asked, whether it's by governments that permit, whether it's by local residents that will have a project next door to them, or customers who say, well, this is our CO2 that you're going to store, and you sell me some kind of a certificate, and then I have to trust that it's going to stay in the ground. A lot of these questions are about risk, and how do we deal with it? Is it really going to stay in the ground? Is there not going to be unwanted seismicity, leaks, groundwater contamination? How do the trapping mechanisms work? And you'd be surprised. I mean, I have been surprised, and also many of my team members going out there and telling these stories. Yeah, we really can't assume that people just understand all of this. You know, one of the best things that one of my team members did recently was just bring a piece of core to a town hall meeting with local residents and just explain how it works. Yeah, just also address a lot of myths about carbon storage that persist. With that, yeah, I think also my fellow panel members will say a bit more about this, so I'm not going to go into huge detail. I think I said a lot of it already just now, but all of these areas of finding enough capacity, the containment of the CO2, sustaining injectivity, where we haven't got that much multi-decade experience with sort of many thousands of running hours, and you can find out new things such as halide precipitation or other things, you know, affecting injectivity, and the monitoring, including of groundwater and the air, of course, for which a lot of technology is needed as well. But the good thing about CCS is it does build heavily on the industrial presence and capabilities that the oil and gas industry has got in a lot of basins. And the project funnel that Shell has today, including in Canada, in the US, here in the UK, in the Netherlands, can really build on a lot of expertise, which helps scaling up fast again. I think the next area to cover, and I probably need to, am I doing okay for, still so good for time? Okay, yeah, no, because it's important. I do get to my conclusions. Above ground, of course, for CCS as well. A lot of technology is there today. And maybe the thing I want to emphasize, though, is that there is novelty to integrating all of this in big systems. This is again an area of learning and innovation. For example, the Aramis CCS project in the Netherlands that Shell is in together with Total Energies, EBN and GasUnie. That really is, as far as I know, at least the first of a kind integration of multiple sources of CO2, both from pipeline customers and shipping, from different capture processes, then all going through one trunk line and then into multiple stores with different pressure regimes, and really putting such a CO2 transport and storage system together is really hasn't been done before. So how's that going to work? How can we play the different pressure regimes in the subsurface, the CO2 specifications that are needed to protect the integrity of the system, and then the capture technologies that all these different customers deploy at their sites. So a lot of time and effort going into understanding the behavior of such an integrated system. It's probably not sort of a cutting edge R&D, but in terms of project development, it is really what we spend a lot of time on to really know how we're going to operate this system that will have a capacity ultimately of more than 20 million tons per year. So huge quantities, huge investment, billions of dollars, and really the understanding and simulating how that system would behave and which operator needs to press which button under which conditions is taking a lot of effort. Yeah, shipping, again, no time to go into that, but energy or CO2 carriers are certainly also under development for longer distances. And we see again in Europe with the Northern Lights project, Equinor, Total Energies and Shell in Norway, where this is being pioneered, that shipping CO2 over relatively long distances can also be a cost-effective solution for customers. Then let's start to look a bit more at kind of building with customers and with construction in mind. And this is a good example that I wanted to use. And it relates to capture technology, where really once you're beyond the pilot scale, where you've got the required technology readiness level pretty high, normally 8 or so, I think, to really be able to deploy something in a commercial industrial project. How do you then scale up further, and what do you need to think about? And of course, it all starts with the customer. What is the need out there in the market, and how are customers going to go about installing capture technology at their site? Most customers will, of course, want to benefit from solutions that are to a degree standardized and proven. So, designing something that is unique to each customer, that may sound great, like bespoke tailoring or something. But at the end of the day, again, you get these questions like, well, have you then tried this exact thing before? And if the answer is no, it will be a difficult sell. So if you can standardize and have a couple of archetypes or whatever the term is for different sizes of a capture module, which you can then manufacture centrally, that will be a lot easier, particularly if you then also factor in the logistics constraints, right? So containers are a great thing for logistics, as we know. And before you go to special road transport, where you need to kind of see, shut roads for special transport, or even do temporary widening, or demolish bridges on the way, etc. It suddenly becomes a lot more expensive once you've made that step away from containers to special transport. And if you go beyond special transport and you need to build up everything on site, so the stick build approach, of course, you then get a lot more labor that you need to have on site. And normally the customer has a working site, and they don't have the space or often the desire to have an extra few hundred people walking around building big stuff. So these are all the things that, plus of course the materials that go into it, and how much they are going to cost over time, the contractors that are available to do the detailed design, and the procurement, all these processes are typically the ones that in what I do are quite dominant before you can really press the button and say, yes, let's make a decision and execute. So coming to kind of two summary slides, how we try to deal with some of these dilemmas in Shell is to have, on the one hand, wanting to introduce still new technology and innovate and make projects more competitive and standardized and break new ground. And at the same time, not waiting until we've got the perfect solution and then suddenly start upscaling. The only way really we think is to have a very close link between research and projects, and to be organized in such a way that the project community and the technology development community talk a lot, so that the problems on the table are real and are solutions for real life risks, questions, issues that one of the many stakeholders that we have comes up with, and to be able to then also prioritize and at the same time work with external partners as well, to make sure that industry standards develop. It would be no good if there were multiple standards, for example, for CO2 transport, for monitoring and verification of CO2 stores in different countries. I think from the scenario work, if there's one thing clear, then it's international coordinated action on carbon CO2 abatement is essential. So ways of transporting and storing CO2 internationally are an essential part of the solution. So working with industry, and not only technically, but also in terms of standards is an essential part of that mix. And then, here are maybe a couple of pointers. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. A couple of things maybe to add to it. So I won't read through all of this, but this is kind of a bit of a technical checklist of, once a certain technology makes it into a project concept that is kind of going up for a large-scale execution and related large-scale financial investment. All these factors from, are the construction materials cheap enough and are they available enough? Even if you do it with 500 million tons a year, for example, do we have the people to execute the project? Are we not introducing any unexpected environmental impacts, any emissions that may appear tiny once you do it at a lab or a pilot scale, but again, once you do it all over the world on a gigaton scale, is there some form of emission that we need to worry about now and that authorities will be questioning when you ask for a permit? And what about reliability? Of course, how does it operate? And for example, one thing that could play out is that in a certain capture process, you have a bit more sensitivity to a certain chemical compound or bits of dust carrying over into the CO2, which ultimately you may find back in your reservoir and reacting with the reservoir or plugging your pores or whatever. And then you need to adjust your CO2 specs for the entire system if you want to keep using that technology. So lots to think about technically, also non-technically, and that's really for me to conclude on that I think ultimately it's customers buying products that, as much as governments also making policy, have a quite a decisive voice in all of this. And with that, the questions again, put yourself in the shoes of a bank being asked to fund a project, and what kind of due diligence questions are they going to ask before sending you the money? Think about, yeah, like the example I just gave, a government officer giving a permit somewhere for 20 years and thinking about, well, what novel emissions or risks might this introduce? Or a local resident in a town hall somewhere who's being told, well, you get this big installation not far from you, and don't worry, it's all good, it's all safe, and it will stay underground for 20 years, or this pipeline will cross your land, and it's all fine. Well, what questions would they have? And anticipate them, yeah, the more we can do that de-risking and have those considerations early on in the technology development, the more focused we can be to really achieve the scale and pace of transition needed. Thank you. Let me leave it there.
Thank you. Right, before we move on to the discussion section with our panel, does anyone have, if anyone's got any questions, please wave your hand and our microphone. We have a question over there already.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I would like that you make it very simple for me. Okay, so now how much shell role in producing oil, how much it is, and in 50 years, how much oil you will produce, and out of this oil, how much of this CO2 you will be sequestrating?
Ooh, yeah, it's a question I can't answer simply because I really don't know. I can only point to the scenarios that they all show, again, a decline, a huge decline of fossil fuels, including oil. So oil as an energy carrier will decline very substantially over the coming decades. Yeah, the question of CO2 capture from oil is also hard to answer because really it depends on the feedstock of what process is the oil used for as feedstock, and what will that process look like in the future. Yeah, many processes, for example, producing gasoline for cars, you'll see in the scenarios that road transport by passenger cars is expected to go pretty completely electrical, so that won't exist anymore. So there the answer is very, very minimal. Where oil is used as a feedstock for chemicals, for example, to produce plastics, that then really depends on the rate at which recyclable plastics and bio-based plastics are brought in. So as much as I would like to answer, it's a difficult one. But CCS, let me maybe finish with that. Within Shell's own projections and also what we have published is a large contributor also to decarbonization, but focused more on hydrogen production. First of all, I think that is the key source, and then post-combustion capture from gas-fired power. So I think the link between oil and CCS is a relatively thin one, actually.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else out there? I can't see anyone asking any questions.
Oh, here at the front.
Oh, down there. All right. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, more, yeah.
Oh, is it Nino?
Okay, and then here, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. No, if you
Yes,
the mic.
thank you, first of all, for a fascinating talk. You discussed mega projects and large projects of carbon capture, but the largest project so far was the W.A. Parish coal-fired plant in Texas, and with the Petranova carbon capture facility. And this project has been discontinued and was plagued by huge overcosts. And so how do you think this failure could be avoided in the future?
Yeah, I can't comment on other people's projects, but let me comment then on what I know from our own funnel in Shell. And yeah, so I think a lot of project failure in general is really avoided by proper what we call front-end loading, and then that's what my entire organization is busy with, to really examine all the technical design and operating modes, but also the permitting, the commercial aspects, etc., to really not rush into things without the adequate amount of planning. And typically, spending 10% of the total project cost before you've even taken the final investment decision is quite common. So yeah, proper pre-work and only using technology that indeed has got that demonstrated technology readiness level. And that's why on the basis of Shell's experience at Quest in Canada, which is 1 million tons per year, that is a big project. We are now looking at projects that go to 20 million tons a year. And yes, they are complex and they require a lot of effort and time, right? So big projects, typically you're easily looking at 5 to 7 years. So we're thinking about the projects now that would only go online in 2030 or in the next decade. And yeah, I think in that sense, CCS is not very different from other large projects, whether it's infrastructure or other forms of energy. I don't think it's anything to do with specific technology weaknesses or failures.
Thank you.
Right, last question.
Last
then. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
We're on to the panel.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Nihal Daraj, Imperial College. Great talk. Thank you so much. It's basically a follow-up question on your first question. It's about the decarbonization technologies that Shell is doing. They're doing quite a lot in hydrogen, like sustainable aviation fuels and CCS, obviously. So I just wanted to ask maybe about where do you foresee the greatest potential for hydrogen and CCS outside of Europe and North America? Because we always talk about Europe and North America and basically ignoring everything else, everywhere else in the world. And this would basically fall into a lot of things like, for example, climate justice and, so yeah, what are your views on that?
Yeah. Well, if again, looking at the work being done in-house and the partnerships we have signed up, then for sure it's not only North America and Europe. If you look at, well, where are advantaged areas where there is potential for large-scale storage, and also the customer base. Again, we always have to remind ourselves where are the potential customers. You may well have seen quite a few announcements of MOUs and sort of early stage agreements we have signed in different places, like in China, for example. In Australia, we are part of a partnership with Woodside and others. Middle East is another area where Oman, for example, India. So there's a lot happening in other areas, and I think it's fair to say that today, because the let's say the overall policy and customer climate is maybe not quite where it needs to be to really take those big decisions just yet, but it's well on the way. And I'm generalizing, of course, every opportunity is different. But for sure, there's a lot of early stage project mapping and cooperation going on in these regions. So I expect them to follow. The good thing will be, of course, if we can prove in the most advanced areas where kind of all the fundamentals are in place, then we can all learn and we can upscale even faster without having to reinvent anything.
Thank you. Now, can I invite the panel members onto the stage and yes, Onno can join them. Thank you very much, Onno. Do we have Amy here anywhere? Oh, there. Right, find yourself a seat. Now, we have, in addition to Onno, 4 eminent scientists in their field who are extremely well qualified to discuss various aspects of the energy transition. So the format is exactly for questions is as for the last session. If you're in the audience, when we get to the panel discussion, please wave your hand in the air and one of the helpers will come to your side with a microphone. Online has been very quiet as yet, but we would love you to be asking some questions and posting them in the Q&A for this particular session. So I would like to introduce you to our panel. I will start in the middle with Amy, Amy Basilak. If I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. Amy holds the Canada Research Chair in Clean Energy, and she's a professor at the University of Toronto, and her specialism is, including other things, fuel cells, which is what she'll be talking about today. We have Michelle Bentham from the British Geological Survey, and she's chief scientist for decarbonisation and resource management there. And she will be talking a little bit about geothermal in a minute. We've got Martin Blunt from Imperial College, where he is professor of flow in porous media. So he worries about prediction of multi-phase flows in the subsurface. And he's going to talk a little bit about hydrogen storage in a tick. And then we have Lynn Orr, who is a professor at Stanford in energy resources engineering, and he also worries about complex fluid mixtures in the subsurface, but he's going to give his perspective on CCS to give a more North American viewpoint, perhaps, compared with Onno's Western Europe perspective. But the format is now that each one of the panelists will give a 5-minute presentation. So during those presentations, please think up your questions, and then we will throw it open for a discussion with the floor and the panelists. So could I ask Amy to go to the podium and give us a little rundown on her perspective on the challenges in fuel cells? We'll give her a big clap.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share perspectives today and to discuss this exciting topic of energy transition. My name is Amy Basilak, and as Anne said, I'm from the University of Toronto. So I wanted to share my perspectives on electrochemical energy devices, hydrogen production, and energy production. And I'll basically touch on 3 topics: fuel cells, water electrolyzers, and carbon dioxide electrolyzers, thinking about what are the challenges and opportunities. And it's exciting to share that with you as porous media experts, because I think there's tremendous room and space to contribute to these technologies, which I think are pivotal for the energy transition. As I talk about these technologies, the order of them is in, I think, increasing space and increasing opportunity for contribution from the ground up. So fuel cells, to start with that, as you may or may not know, these are devices that will convert hydrogen into electricity with water and heat. And in contrast to things like combustion devices, engines, steam turbines and such, we want to take advantage of going small. So a lot of these devices, all of these devices rely on catalysts and making full use of those surface areas. So as you all know, as we go down in size, our ratio of surface area to volume increases. And this is really important for things like the catalyst layer. And as we want to maximize the use of the catalyst in fuel cells, we also want to optimize the transport of reactants and products. And so I just have a couple examples in each of these slides of showing where people are doing interesting things, and I think that you can relate to. And so, for example, in the example on your left, this is from Martin Blunt's group, and he's using machine learning to perform image analysis, image processing, which is generally very difficult to do when using X-ray imaging. And so these are some examples of materials that he applies machine learning to for image processing, and this is gas diffusion media. And on the right, this is an example from Mark Pratt's group, and he's also an expert in porous media. And in the fuel cell, there's multiple length scales. There's microporous layer, it has nanoscale pores, and then the gas diffusion layer, which is micron scale pores. And here he combines this multi-scale approach using X-ray imaging and FIB-SEM to analyze transport through these 2 very distinct materials that they create a composite. And so these are still challenges for fuel cells today. And I think that's, should inspire. And also fuel cells have an opportunity to be, well, we are facing a transition in itself, because there's chemicals or materials that are used in traditional fuel cells that are deemed, forever chemicals, if you've heard of them, PFSAs. And so we're going to start to think about new materials and new ways of, thinking about how to construct the fuel cell. Then in terms of water electrolyzers, these are things that we need to produce hydrogen. And as we saw in our plenary speakers talk, that we need to really rely on renewable energy, and creating hydrogen is a key aspect. So in water electrolyzers, one of the key challenges is, aside from the catalysts, which are not abundant materials, we have titanium that's used in the transport layer, this very porous material, and titanium is also very expensive and difficult to make. So here's an example. This is done in the Adam Weber's group on the left-hand side by Dr. Jason Lee, who's a postdoc in that group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And they're using tape casting to produce new novel titanium porous transport layers. It's a very novel method, and it's something that's very much needed. Is how do we get these materials? How do we create them? And the right's an example of also Dr. Lee's work in using nano CT at a synchrotron at the NSLS to characterize these catalyst layers. And the catalyst that's used in water electrolyzers are about 10 times less abundant than the platinum that's used in fuel cells. And in terms of, I said, we're increasing space of opportunity for growth, water electrolyzers, their lifetime's now around 40,000 hours state of the art, but we need to get to 80,000 hours. So still double the lifetime we need to achieve in these materials. And then the last one I want to touch on is carbon dioxide electrolyzers. This is a very quickly emerging field, but still very much in its infancy. The idea of converting carbon dioxide into a useful fuel, a carbon neutral fuel, or into chemical feedstocks. And so it's a very exciting field, but again, very new. Just like fuel cells and water electrolyzers, we rely on effective use of the catalyst layer, but still developing what are those catalysts is still an unknown, still sort of so many things to be explored. And as I'm showing this really nice perspective that's from the Burgundy group, one of the problems is this production of carbonate salts that clogs up the transport layer. So as we're producing trying to convert the carbon dioxide, we produce hydroxides, and these leads to bicarbonates in these very alkaline environments. So this is another transport issue dealing with catalyst layers, porous materials. And on the right is an example, came from my group, and we were looking at the voltage instabilities that arise from bubbles that nucleate and clog the in the electrolyte region of the carbon dioxide electrolyzer. So there's still very much many things to contribute to. And I'm excited to share that with this group because I think there's space for many people to contribute. And that's my bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'll ask Michelle now, and she's going to give us a quick overview of her thoughts on geothermal.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. So Michelle Bentham from the British Geological Survey, and I'm going to talk a little bit about geothermal energy. But first of all, I just wanted to make the point that we really need to think about the subsurface as a technology for the energy transition. Much of what we're talking about today is all based around rocks. We can store radioactive waste in low permeable rocks for safe long-term storage because nuclear power is a low carbon energy, carbon capture and storage in porous media capped by impermeable layers, thinking about geothermal, energy storage, hydrogen storage. So this is just one of many technologies that we could be using the subsurface for in the future. So not only is it just these individual technologies we need to think about in separation, but how they might interact in the subsurface and how we might identify suitable places to do these things. So geothermal energy, what is it? Well, it's all energy, heat energy that's trapped and stored in the solid earth. And this can be from very deep depths where we're looking at granite emplacements through to very shallow, so your back garden, which could be used for a form of geothermal energy. So just starting at the shallow depths, intuitively at the bottom, not at the top, lower temperatures. So you're really thinking about heating and cooling here. Something like ground source heat pumps, where there's a closed loop going into the subsurface, you're injecting fluids and producing them to either store or produce heat. A technology we're also looking at is storage of heat in mines, old coal mines, for example. In the UK particularly, there are coal mines under towns, under populous areas, which typically experience fuel poverty. That's because when the coal mines were produced, population centres grew around them. Those old mine workings over time fill with water. That means that there is a heated water in the subsurface that's now being looked at for producing geothermal energy. So those mines could be producing heat and contributing to reducing fuel poverty in the future. I'm sorry, my slides seem to have gone. Yeah, okay. Sedimentary basins, so looking at sandstone rocks. This is slightly deeper. So we're thinking about slightly higher temperatures. Maybe we could use in large spaces, district heating, and also thinking about some hotter temperatures towards really starting to think about industrial uses. And then the very high temperature. These are much more niche in the UK, but elsewhere around the world, into volcanic igneous rock, so deep granites, where you're looking at not porous and permeable rock, but fracture flow in crystalline impermeable rocks. And they produce much higher temperatures. So you could be producing steam, for example, which can then generate electricity. So lots of different scenarios, lots of different types of geothermal, all with slightly different technologies and all looking at slightly different connectivity for fluids. So we want to think about some of the research challenges for geothermal, but really it's all about de-risking the technology and helping develop regulation. So we want to characterize the heat resource. We need to understand how much heat there is. How sustainable is that heat? For example, how many geothermal projects could you have in one coal mine or in one town? We need to really understand the flow in the subsurface and the connectivity. And we need to really think about the impacts of geothermal and the environment, because the subsurface isn't a pristine environment. It's a pristine environment that you might be introducing fluids into and changing the chemistry and biology of that environment. And really, to understand geothermal energy, we need to work from a pore scale right through to a field scale. And that's the challenge, as Onno made really clear. It is upscaling that's really important. We have to understand the chemistry and the changes to the geochemistry, which could either clog up pore spaces or help promote geothermal. Changes to the geomicrobiology. Could we end up growing bacteria down there that could affect geothermal production? Geophysics is important, and of course, the environmental impact of geothermal. So it's a real multidisciplinary, complex problem, but it's a really accessible, renewable technology that could help us really decarbonize heat, which is one of the more tricky areas to decarbonize. And just a final slide, again, really just to highlight that scale problem. We need to go from the pore scale right to the field scale and using techniques, but it's not just using techniques at each of those different scales, it's the linking between them and the workflows and the processes so that we can really understand the entire system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. I think it's Martin now, Lynn,
Yeah.
Sorry.
We'll see.
Yeah, Martin's going to talk a little bit about hydrogen and then Lynn will finish on the CCS.
Okay, yes. So I'm going to talk about energy storage using gas. The picture there actually shows quite a number of our research group who are actually here at this meeting. So, oh, right. The picture there shows a number of our research group who are here at this meeting. So just to put this in perspective, and it's already been referred to in the previous presentation, is that as we move towards a renewable energy economy, we do need to have energy storage in some sense. And just to give you sort of a scale of numbers, and I'm using strict SI units, global energy production at the moment in electricity, global electricity production is about 600 exajoules every year. And so we're going to need to balance out the intermittency to have, exajoule scale energy storage of one type or another. And the time scales for doing this are going to be everything from minutes to seasonal. So I've got some numbers there to see how you might store that energy. It's rather intriguing. You can have compressed gas. So that's the PDV energy associated with 1 kilogram of an ideal gas being compressed to about 100 bar pressure. There's also, of course, thermal energy storage, which was touched upon in the previous speaker. And again, for 1 kilogram of water with a temperature change of 100 degrees C, you actually get more or less the same energy. And of course, there's hydrogen. And of course, for 1 kilogram of hydrogen, you can store a lot more energy because we're looking at the latent heat of combustion. So where are we going to do this energy storage? Well, there are really a number of places that have the capacity to be at that exajoule scale. And these are either going to be engineered salt caverns. So basically dissolve away the salt and you put either your compressed air or your hydrogen into those caverns, or of course, in the subsurface in porous media. So I've been tasked to say what are the research challenges in porous media associated with this, and I didn't have to do any work whatsoever because I could simply look at a couple of absolutely first-rate review papers that have discussed it. So you can see that on the slide, and some of the things that we need to deal with which are different from CO2 storage is, of course, with hydrogen or compressed gas, we're putting the stuff in and we need to get it back out again. And so that does introduce some unique challenges. There are challenges associated with the hysteresis, there are challenges associated with the mixing of the gas with a cushion gas. And I think one of the key challenges is understanding bacterial activity. So it's a number of things that have been talked about in this meeting, but really being able to predict and deal with potential bacterial degradation, particularly of hydrogen, I think is one of the key challenges, certainly when we're looking at subsurface storage in porous media. These challenges are interlinked. So I'm not going to take away from Lynn's time, so I'll let you just look at the slide, but there are interlinked challenges in the subsurface with both geothermal, with both CCS, and with hydrogen. So I'll just end with one example of where things are a little bit different. So as I said, unlike CO2 storage, you both want to put the gas in, but you want to take it out. And when you do that, of course, the gas can be trapped in the pore space. We're well aware of that. But what's rather intriguing is that you can get a process where trapped material rearranges in the pore space. And it's through transport in the aqueous phase. It's a process called Oswald ripening. And that actually does change the hysteresis. So just as an example here is an estimate of the timescales to reach equilibrium through this process at different length scales and what it might mean for larger scale modeling and assessment. So what we traditionally do is, of course, if we want to understand any sort of subsurface storage, we dust off a petroleum reservoir simulator essentially, and we use hydrocarbon type flow functions. And the suggestion is that when we're looking at possibly CO2 storage, but certainly hydrogen storage, in fact, those functions may not be correct. So I've looked at this with capillary pressure. I'm not suggesting there's no hysteresis and capillary pressure for hydrogen storage, but I am suggesting that the behavior, the macroscopic behavior is likely to be different from that we've already established in the oil industry. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
And now Lynn talking about CCS.
Well, we've actually had a very nice exploration of multi-scale from the fuel cell scale with reaction catalysis and various kinds of transport, geothermal systems. Michelle's point that they're multi-scale. If any meeting represents multi-scale, this is one that we're at together. The hydrogen storage, Martin wants to put hydrogen and get it back. The CO2 storage folks want to put it down there and keep it there. So Martin's designing to avoid trapping. The CCS crowd should be designing to keep it in place. And it's clear from all the presentations here that there's not only is there a huge amount of work that's related across these fields, but that a lot of progress has been made and we know a lot about what these things do. So one question to ask is, okay, how do we do this at bigger scale? We're ready for that, I think, in the CCS business, as Onno said. So I don't really need to say, why do we need to do this? We need to do deep reductions in uses of fossil fuels, for example, by electrifying things like transportation. But at the same time, we need a system of power generation that can deal with the intermittencies, and we may need to think about how to capture low concentration sources to see to deal with previously emitted amounts. Now, that's interesting. How about we get this whole thing up there? So if you think about CCS, what's involved? Well, the first part is the capture side. There are well-established ways to do this now, but I'll argue in just a minute that there's room for considerably more research on how to do this in ways that might be less costly. Two kinds of sources: high concentrations, so combustion product gases, for example, production of natural gas, or low concentration sources, think air. With intermediates from things like metals, steel production, or hydrogen, or cement manufacture, for example. So, okay, so what do we do? So here's my list with more words and less good graphics than my colleagues here. I would start with saying we should think about the capture side of things. The capture arena is full of porous media problems that could be combinations of electrochemistry, of transport, of materials changing phases. So plenty of opportunity there. Some of it linked to the kinds of fuel cell and electrolysis applications that you heard about. We should also think about all of this from the systems standpoint. Onno made this point, I think, quite nicely, that no matter how good our subsurface storage project is, it has to get permitted. It has to be put in place, has to have capture, some transportation to get the CO2 to where it needs to be stored. And so in order to pull off projects at big scale, and we will need a lot of projects at big scale, we need to do this in a way that thinks about these systems and that fits the carbon capture and storage into a set of systems that can operate over time. I think we ought to work on extending the range of porous media. I want to said this too, that we know how to deal with the kinds of structures that you see in saline aquifers and oil and gas reservoirs. Basalts offer opportunities if we can manage the flow and the delivery of CO2 so that it can mineralize. Mine tailings are a high surface area of some reactive silicates that might be put to use. So the research community should be thinking about how do we extend that range. Full physics modeling. Well, we've seen an awful lot of really good physics modeling of these multi-scale kinds of problems at this meeting. And I think we need to be thinking about this in the range of timescales. So sometimes timescales are short, some kind of timescales are long. In an aquifer, for example, the mineralization timescale might be quite long, whereas the timescale for solubility and trapping is much shorter. So thinking about the various timescales, and then finally thinking about what we know how to do with regard to trapping the CO2 in the subsurface. Let's think about designing processes that accelerate that trapping as much as we can. And at the same time, we need to think about how we're going to manage a system where, for example, pressures need to be limited for total injection to prevent induced seismicity. We need to think about the geomechanics as we want to be sure that we don't activate faults in a way that makes earthquakes. So we need to be able to explore these timescales for the various actions in a way that allows us to design projects safely. But then when we come to the question of design, we may not need all of that detail. We will not need all of that detail for every system. So think about what it takes to do a project at scale. We need to select sites, so we need to think about making that a process that's as step by step as we can make it. Here are the kinds of things that people need to think about in order to select a site and characterize it. We need to think about what kinds of issues are going to be brought up in the permitting process. So at least in onshore North America, the permitting people are going to want to know what are the pressures going to do, what's the extent of how far is the CO2 going to propagate, what's the potential for leakage, and whether or not the assorted liability parts of it have been thought about. So being prepared to do that and having a set of tools that allows us to do all that in a way that can be done more quickly and more systematically than we do in all the full scale modeling of it. We still need the modeling, but we need to have some models that have the right level of physical representation. If we have to do a full physics model with full heterogeneity of everything for every big project, we won't do them as fast as we need to. I already argued for design for accelerating the trapping mechanisms. And then I'll end with saying, look, we need to have efficient and relatively low cost ways of monitoring where the CO2 is going, detecting leaks early, being aware of the risks and a plan to mitigate them as we go forward, and to deal with problems as they occur. We should take our knowledge of all the physical mechanisms and put that to work with the remote sensing world to figure out how to do this efficiently and not too expensively. And I think that's a good place for me to stop, and I think we'll respond to questions.
All right, thank you, Lynn. I'm sorry, I'm just checking whether there's any questions online yet, so please get typing if you're online. I see Sebastian already has a question. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the nice presentations. And Anne, you said you wanted a sort of a controversial question. Here's my attempt for one. We talk great science here at InterPore, but at the end of the day, isn't the real issue that we're taking the ball off the societal impact and how we communicate science to the broader public? Because if geothermal, the great examples, geothermal gone wrong, it's not being accepted. In the Netherlands, we have Groningen, we have failed CO2 storage sites that weren't permitted because of public pushback. The greatest science in the world, but if we don't manage that interaction communication with the non-technical stakeholders, we're not going to get anywhere. And that also then spins over how universities interact with the energy industries, which we need to develop CCS, hydrogen storage. And their first university have put moratoriums on accepting any funding from the energy industry, not just oil and gas, but any funding period. So what do we need to do to engage and increase our science communication?
Who wants to answer first? Shall I hand to Martin?
I mean, I agree with you, Sebastian. I think it's our duty as scientists to be able to communicate what we're doing to a wider public and to engage properly with societal concerns. But it's something difficult because we're all busy in the day job. I think in terms of the interaction between universities and industry, I mean, I'd say from Imperial College, we no longer do teaching and research that is primarily focused on the extraction or discovery of fossil fuels, but we can still get funding from the energy industry, indeed explicitly the oil and gas industry, as long as it's part of the energy transition. So I would say very strongly for those in university environments, simply saying we are not taking money from certain companies and therefore preventing the development of things that are absolutely necessary for the future, I think is a mistaken policy, frankly.
I think Lynn has.
Yeah, I agree as usual with Martin, but at the question of public acceptance is one that we do have to take seriously. And it's completely reasonable for people to want to understand what's going to happen and what the risks are for them. I think one lessons we've learned mostly by doing badly at it are that early engagement in thinking about a project and what impacts might be on the community and what measures are taken to make it be safe. That's way better than having to try this after the miscommunication has gone on too long. So early engagement with communities and being quite open about what both the potential risk and how to avoid them is an important part of it. This question of how do we make our way through this transition? I think this is actually, it's a hard one. Think about a world in which, right now, fossil carbon is embedded in practically everything we do across the way we handle energy and materials in modern societies. So we need to continue to supply those services at the same time that we are sharply reducing the amount of carbon that gets to the atmosphere. Managing the complex interplay of all those systems of complex systems is one thing that we have to learn to do better. But in the meantime, we also have to think about how to do this at the kind of scale that needs to be done. And as much as I think that university research is an important part of the deal, we aren't going to deliver that at scale. That will be done with companies, many of them with global reach. And that system can be more productive if we all work together than it will be if we try to do it as adversaries. Now, there's certainly value to having university research have its own independence. I think one of the things we might bring to it is that we're willing to work on the crazy stuff that might, in the end, not be crazy eventually. So we need to have wide horizons. But at the same time, we need to think about how do we get those into action, and that will require work with industry.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, reflecting on what Onno was saying about the plan, looking forward into 2040, 2050, and you were talking about ways of speeding up projects. We know subsurface projects take typically 5 to 10 years from design to fruition. If you feed in all the research we're doing, how are is the research we're doing now going to make a difference by 2040 when we need to have made a real difference to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words about that, linking also to the previous question. So if I think about Canada or Louisiana, where we have projects in the still early stages of planning, we are already engaging with the public, explaining, in those regions where we're doing appraisal drilling, for example, or shooting seismic, having town halls and explaining what we intend to do, but also that it may not happen because the project hasn't selected its technical concept. So even a project that hasn't passed even the feasibility gate yet, and therefore still has time to incorporate new technology, because typically that only happens at what we call the concept selection stage, which could be like a year or 2 years after passing feasibility. But we are already engaging with the public and bringing out the engineers, because that's the other lesson I think we learned, that the public wants to hear from the technical people who do the actual technical work. So we now always bring technical staff into those town halls to explain firsthand how things work, and not sort of leave it to the communications department to do the talking. So yeah, I think in terms of 2040, absolutely, projects that are only coming on stream still in the 2020s can still benefit from new technology. Maybe not sort of something radically different, but a lower cost way of monitoring potential emissions. Can that still be applied in projects we intend to do in Canada or the US? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's plenty of opportunity there.
Any thoughts? Or I've got a question that possibly starts with Amy and then moves on. It specifically says it's from online, and it's about using other materials, in this case specifically for batteries, but I think it feeds into the discussions you had about various rare materials for the catalysts that you're engaged with. The mining for these raw materials can be very environmentally damaging. There's not a lot of them around because they're rare materials, and they're not evenly distributed around the world. So there's potential for political stresses in supply and demand of those. And I wondered if you'd like to comment.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. I'll extend it to the sphere that I'm sort of more familiar with is in the precious metals that are used in fuel cells and electrolyzers, and mining is an issue. I think that we need to think more about the unintended consequences of our technologies, and as we've heard from our panelists, that engaging with communities and partnering with communities is an important piece of moving forward with technology and science. In particular, the use of these precious metals or these materials that are coming from specific places, it is a problem. And so that's why in terms of electrochemical energy, there's a big push for looking for abundant materials. And that's it's a very hugely challenging because the performance isn't there. So it's a challenge. And I think that it can't be ignored, but it probably has been ignored for too long.
Yeah. Okay, Michelle, I think, oh, yeah, sorry, Michelle, and then Lynn.
Yeah, just a comment on the supply of rare earths. There's never been so much interest in this from governments, and it's a geopolitical problem largely, and supply chains and countries wanting to secure their supply for their usage. The BGS has recently been funded to run a critical minerals intelligence center funded by what was BEIS. I'm not quite sure what they are now, but it's really looking at those stocks and flows. And there's a bit of a myth. There's not really such thing as a rare earth. There are more difficult things to get hold of, but there's lots of supply there. It's where it's coming from, it's how it's mined, and it's who's mining it. For example, you're right, there's the environmental and social equity as well. So the supply and the supply chain and stocks and flows is probably the biggest challenge, rather than there not being enough of them.
I think over to Lynn.
The other thing we need to be thinking about here is that, well, I'll use lithium as an example, even though of course it's not rare at all. The concentration of lithium in a used lithium ion battery is a lot higher than the concentration of lithium in practically any of the mined resources that are there. So now, in order to establish a robust recycling system, you actually have to have enough of them out there to be recycled. So there is a kind of a chicken and egg problem. But we should be thinking about designs when it comes to batteries or all the other places we use these kinds of elements, to the eventual recovery and reuse of them, which, if done right, will limit the total amount of mining that we have to do in order to supply the world's needs.
Yeah, I think Michelle'd like to.
Just a really quick response to that, just linking all the technologies together. As I said, all these subsurface technologies are linked. Geothermal energy could be made more economic by producing lithium from the fluids as well, particularly from the deep sources. So it's nice sort of links.
Okay, thank you. So, and then there's another question online, which is for Onno, which is basically about, well, it notes that Shell, like many oil companies, made a large profit in 2022, and about reinvestment of that profit in renewables. And it's how much of that reinvestment in renewables is because of the structure of independent companies where you have to respond to your shareholders and provide them with a feedback. So is it that the focus on giving good dividends to your shareholders limiting your ability to then reinvest profits in renewables?
Well, it's a big question,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure I can answer that. I can only look at my own role in Shell, and what I encounter as limiting factors for investment in CCS, right? So because my job is to prepare lots of big CCS projects, and I think many of the questions that come up to judge these investment decisions I have addressed, and I'm not a financial person, so I don't want to go into the financial side of things, but I think it's fair to say that the issue is often not so much, is there the capital available? It's all the other things, lots of investors, including Shell, are happy to invest money in good projects, but you have to be able to de-risk the project and to have a business case. And it starts with customers that are happy to buy the products to store their CO2, for example, to pay a tariff for it. You need to get the permits, you need to prove the technology works. So the amount of technical assurance alone, which is kind of what all feeds into the decisions that we make and that I'm responsible for, is quite phenomenal. It also comes back to the question around failed projects. Why do big projects fail? And there are a lot of big failed projects, or let's say underperforming projects, maybe is a better word than failure. Lots of underperforming projects out there. And often that has nothing to do with whether they are renewable or not. It's just poor project preparation. If you think again about this front-end loading and why mega projects fail, there's good books written about it that they teach us at the Shell Project Academy, and that really those questions are far more prevalent, certainly in my job, than the question like, is there ultimately the money or not? Because there is money for good projects for sure.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one more question. I'm aware that we need to be wrapping up by 1:55 to get you back to the session. So we have a question over there, and then I think Sarah has a question.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the economics of CCS. I mean, of course, research and development can contribute to reduce these relative costs, as it can reduce the risks and increase the social acceptance. So how approximately is the relative economic cost of CCS if you add it to a common power plant, and how did that reduce in the past, let's say 10 years, due to research and development?
All right, sorry, you'll have to repeat the last bit on cost reduction for power plants.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the relative economic overhead which you have if you do CCS, if you add CCS to a power plant, and how that relative cost got reduced due to research and development in the past 10 years, approximately. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I think that's a tough question, because power plants with CCS, there's not many, I guess it's all fairly theoretical. And yeah, again, I don't want to comment about individual projects, but in general, retrofitting CCS to a power plant is not something you would easily do. It's in the merit order of power generation, one of the expensive areas. For sure, maybe that's the only thing I will say, and then I'll hand it over. The cost of post-combustion capture, because that's what we are talking about here, has come down by, I don't know exactly how much, but tens of percentage points over the past years. Because of better technology, better amine resilience, etc. But is that enough? That's the bigger question, maybe.
Yeah, it depends a lot on what the source looks like. So it's tougher with coal for sure, just as much as anything, because there's other stuff in the combustion products from coal than just CO2 and water. But it also goes with the concentration. Natural gas power plant, you handle more fluid because the concentrations are lower, but there's less stuff required because it's not as bad a mix. And then if you are willing to do an air separation upstream and then burn with the fuel with pure CO2, then you've paid for the CO2 capture in the air separation unit, so the final stage is lower. I've seen claims that they can build a natural gas power plant that is competitive with combined cycle plant today, with not much additional cost than the CO2 capture. If you want it to be really expensive, you do it with the lowest concentration source, and that's the air. So the answer, Onno's answer is that it depends, is correct. It depends.
Thank you. So we'll have one more question from Sarah, and just to warn the panel that I'm going to finish the session by asking each one of you to name the one thing from your perspective that needs to be done, researched, or changed in order to enable us to reach that less than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2040. Okay, so have a think. Over to you, Sarah.
I don't know if we have enough time for all this. Sarah Gazda, Norse in Bergen, Norway. Thanks to all the panel. A question to Onno and maybe others. You put up numbers, 2,000 to 3,000 CO2 storage projects to reach the targets. I've used similar numbers. Depending on your timescale perspective, that could be on the order of hundreds of CO2 projects, storage projects online a year, twice, 2 a week. If you give yourself double the amount of time, that's 1 a week. And these are enormous numbers. We know we have the storage capacity. We know we have the drilling rigs. A couple hundred wells a year is not outside of anything that's normal for the oil and gas industry. But as we mentioned with wind and solar, there comes these other external things that create bottlenecks. There's no technical bottlenecks. We mentioned society, but does Shell, do you have the resources to take your share of that 2 projects online a week for the next 20, 30 years? Who is going to take that burden? Do we have enough humans with enough expertise to do this? What are the universities doing to prepare the new workforce and if we don't reach those targets, should we give up? That was a hard question, sorry.
Yeah, another hard one now, but I think for sure on the resourcing, I think that I think it was Amy who was showing that indeed the subsurface as a key part of energy transition and having the education to go with that and the fresh talent and the continued attention in research is all pretty essential because when I look at Shell today and at my team, I mean I've got quite a large team, and like I said, there's hundreds of people, of technical professionals working this, and yes, they can handle quite a large funnel of projects in preparation, what then the share is and what it will be over time, that's all hard to comment because it depends on all these factors. But in principle, if I look today, then yes, it's a noticeable part of the subsurface population working CO2 storage and hydrogen storage. The appetite is there, absolutely. And like you said, indeed, the number of drilling rigs, the energy industry has shown that it can upscale to these sort of levels within decades, so yes, it is possible, but it does rely on the continued inflow of new talent, and that is a concern indeed. If that is addressed, and also what I see in the service industry, I mean, you should see my inbox. Every oil and gas service provider is keen to and is also, going into CCS and going multi-skilled, multi-purpose, if you like. So I think the signs are really positive, and it's been demonstrated that it can be done. Maybe the last thing to say is what really helps, I think, is building hubs, and that's what we are trying to do. So not have all these point-to-point projects for one customer and one sink, but like the Aramis project in the Netherlands and the UK clusters as well here, to really go large industrial scale and look at 10, 20 million tons per year, this decade, and then build it out further so that ultimately you have hubs, a bit like what you saw happening in oil and gas as well, that you get more and more concentration in the really most advantaged basins at a really large scale, rather than having, thousands of dots all over the world.
Okay, thank you. So we're now moving on to the last few minutes, 5 seconds ahead. What are you going to get done in the next 17 years in order to get the world to less than 1.5? Lynn
I'm
can
holding the
start as
mic,
you're
so I
holding the
think
mic,
that puts
sorry.
me on the- Okay, you said, but you changed the question, but.
All right, stick
but-
with the first question, whichever one you like.
So I'll think about it and pick the one that seems easiest. No, if I could only change one thing, I would ask for a price or prices on carbon. And because that would help in some of the projects that have had difficulties. It's been, for example, that the Paris project that was mentioned, it had troubles because it was being supported by enhanced oil recovery and the price of oil dropped. Now there were some technical things as well, but nevertheless, that's what it causes. So a price really paying attention to the externality of carbon emissions would help a lot.
Okay, thank you. Amy.
From my Canadian perspective, I would say that because of my work in very early TRL, I think that there should be a stronger communication and coordination between government and researchers. Right now, Canada launched its hydrogen strategy in 2020, which is fantastic, but it's heavily focused on jobs today. And I think the government needs to also think long-term, have long-term vision, and think about things that are early TRL, enabling people to invest in new technologies and think long-term. So that's one thing I think is shortcoming in Canada, probably in other places.
Yeah, more tax breaks for research to encourage investment, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe, and just also just being open to listening and dialogue between communities and researchers.
Thank you, Amy. Martin.
Yeah, sort of related to Lynn's point, I mean, another mechanism that people have proposed to get to net zero would in fact be to put an obligation on fossil fuel producing companies to either reduce their CO2 emissions or store a certain percentage of their CO2 emissions. And that, you know, say 3% in the first year, then 6% and so on. So by 2050, it's 100%. I mean, an economic mechanism would also work, but a mechanism to make it happen.
All right, and the final word to Michelle.
Oh, you didn't say it had to be realistic. So
no,
get on with it. We could have had a project in the UK 10 years ago, and for reasons not technical, we don't. So accept that the subsurface has multiple potential for decarbonisation and get on with it and accept some risk, and it is going to cost.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty unrealistic.
Yeah, basically, we can do it. Let's do it. So let's give a big hand to all our panelists. And of course, to you, the audience, thank you for being here and participating in the forum.